Hey guys, PotatoMcWhiskey here, and today we're doing a deity Pantheon tier list. This is going to go over every single Pantheon in the game and give you my thoughts and ranking of them. There are a couple of biases to note, particular ways that I play, and we'll quickly go over that when it becomes relevant. So, just to kind of describe how the list is written, and there will be a link to this document in the comments, or in the description, either or. There'll probably be a pinned comment too. So this is the name of the Pantheon, this is the effect of the Pantheon, this is the strength of the Pantheon. So for example, something that gives you +1 food is pretty weak, but something that gives you +1 great person point is pretty strong, is a little bit stronger. And then something that gives you a lot of faith would be like something that would be rated the strongest. And so these are kind of relatively scaled to each other. It's kind of like my attempt at an objective measure of the power level of the different aspects of a Pantheon. So this is how strong the bonus that the Pantheon provides, and this is how situational the bonus that the Pantheon provides. So for example, something like God of Craftsman here, which is +1 production from mines over strategic resources, it's pretty inconsistent and it's pretty situational, but it's pretty strong. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of where these scores are coming from. And then to generate the tier score of the Pantheon, we multiply these two numbers together. So Goddess of Harvest is 5 and 5, which is 25, which is the highest score. And then Initiation Rites is 1 and 1, which is 1. So that's the lowest score. And then these Pantheons are graded by color according to their percentile. So pretty much anything in green, like they're the good Pantheons. Anything in sort of a yellowish green, they're like, oh, okay, they're okay. Then once you get down to yellow, like these are the okay-ish ones. And then when you get down to the orange, these are like the mediocre ones. And then once you're getting down to like 6 and into the reds, these are like the kind of ones that are just bad. Like they're just pretty bad. And then there is the bias score. And this is like my own personal way of taking that sort of a objective assessment of the score of the Pantheon and then adding my own sort of plus or minus based on my experience and the way that I play and how I feel about the Pantheon. And so, for example, God of the Forge, it has a tier score of 16, but I gave it an extra 4 points because I feel like it's pretty strong. And I feel like there's a lot of ways you can use it and it's flexible, but it's kind of limited in some ways. So, and then I have my notes here. So starting from the strongest to the weakest, in my opinion, we are going to get started with the Goddess of the Harvest. Goddess of the Harvest is almost certainly, in my opinion, without a doubt, the strongest Pantheon in the game. It has a lot of things going for it. For example, it generates faith on demand. You can generate faith when you need it. Chopping, it works with chopping, and chopping is already very strong. And it has already synergy with Magnus, as chopping does, so it like reinforces some areas of the gameplay that are already really strong, and it generates faith. Now, generating faith is really good because faith is very flexible in the current iteration of the game. You can use faith to get great people, you can use it to get military units in the mid game, you can use it for tourism victories, you can use it for pretty much any victory, depending on if you want to spend your faith in a particular way. It's just a really, really flexible resource, and it's actually quite hard to get a lot of faith. And Goddess of the Harvest gives you a lot of faith. So that's why it's up there. It just has a lot of benefits. It's really, really flexible, and it gives you a lot. The only downside to it is that you are limited by how many chops you get. So that's kind of like the downside. Because sometimes you might not want to chop a tile. But if you have the Goddess of the Harvest, it makes a tile that you might not want to chop. You feel really bad if you don't chop it because you're getting so much if you chop it. You know what I mean? And then we have God of the Forge. This gives you plus 25% production towards ancient and classical era units. I rated it at about a 4 strength and a 4 situationalness. There are, you can almost always get value out of it, but there are situations in which it won't be good. Whereas if you compare that to God of the Harvest, that's a 5/5, which means it's always really strong and it's very resilient against situationals occurrences. Very rarely do I get into a game where I don't have many chops. God of the Forge, on the other hand, sometimes I'm just not in the right position to conduct a classical age war, or I don't want to do a war, or I'm against an opponent that has like a classical age unique unit that will make war difficult, so on and so forth. Like there's things that can make it, hard to use, and it also is limited by some other factors. It has a limited window of usefulness. It applies to relatively weak units, mostly the ancient era units. Those are pretty weak. The horseman is probably the horseman and the swordsman are probably the two units that I think the God of the Forge is sort of most powerful in conjunction with. And there's a bit of an opportunity cost to going to war. However, war is really strong, and this gives you production when production is really, really strong. And war, particularly early, has the potential to snowball you. So that's why I think God of the Forge is a really, really good Pantheon. And I think there's a lot of the time, if you kind of know what you're doing, you can get value out of the God of the Forge. I will say, though, if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know how to assess a situation in deity, you're going to struggle if you take God of the Forge and you just blindly start pumping out warriors. You do kind of have to read things a little bit and plan things to get like the maximum value out of God of the Forge. But I'd say it's a very consistent, very strong Pantheon. Now we have Earth Goddess, and the +1 faith, again, it's because, it gives you faith. It gives a decent amount of faith. Faith is very flexible. Faith is hard to get. It has a decent bit of synergy with a culture victory. It just has a lot of nice things going for it. And I particularly have a bit of a bias towards culture victories, which is why I rated this just that little bit higher than its sort of objective score would lead you to believe. There are some downsides to Earth Goddess. For example, mines reduce appeal, and mines are very strong. So you're kind of having this push-pull relationship with your mines and your appeal. You want mines even if you're going for a culture victory because they help you snowball your production and get a big lead. And then you replace them all with forests later in the game to get extra tourism. And the other limitation of Earth Goddess is that it's limited by population and appeal. There's a lot of, you could have... So it's limited by population and appeal. So you could have a lot of tiles in your city that have the +1 faith, but you need to work other tiles. And you just don't have the population to work those particular tiles with the appeal. And you might build some mines, which might knock the faith off a few of your tiles. So it is a really good Pantheon, but I think it's better the longer the game goes. So situationally, it can be incredibly strong, but most of the time, if you're going for a tourism victory, it'll do like good work for you. Then we have Divine Spark. This is another Pantheon that I would rate as a decent sort of strength. It's not too strong, and it is very situation agnostic. It's always going to provide you value. Whether that's if you're going for a fast religion, it's really good for that. It scales well with your empire, big or small. And it's very flexible because you can go for a culture victory, you can go for a scientific victory. It does just barely help for a religious victory, but I think you would be better off securing a religion using holy site projects and then getting a faith generation Pantheon so you can spam missionaries and stuff. Great people points are incredibly valuable. I think the last time I calculated, it's like one great person point is worth about 16 gold-ish. Something along those lines, and a little bit less faith. I can't remember exactly how much faith it is off the top of my head. It's like 5 faith or something. But one great person point is worth 16 gold. So that's really valuable. The only major downside to it is that it requires infrastructure. So you need to build up your holy sites, you need to build up your campuses, you need to build your theater squares. And the other limitation is that one aspect of the benefit, the holy site, profit points, they only really apply in the early game. But other than that, it has a fairly low impact. Like, it's not going to completely change your game, but I find it to be just a really nice and consistent bonus that lets me get away with being greedy about not doing holy site projects when I want a religion, and when I want a religion and to transition that religion into a tourism game. So that's why I rate it quite highly. It's like my personal rating. I think it's quite good. It probably deserves to be at a strength of 2, but I think a rating of 18 is that's my personal score. I'd say I really like it. I have a lot of fun using it, so maybe I'm a little bit biased there. That's what the bias column is for. Then we have God of the Open Sky. Now, God of the Open Sky is +1 culture from pastures. I would rate this as a very strong bonus. It's a 4 out of 5, but it's a little bit situational because it requires you to have pasture tiles. Now, pastures are fairly common, which is, which is good. So it means it's not too situational, but that does sort of bring it down a little bit. So it's only like sitting at like a 12 score. Now, a 12 score doesn't mean it's half as good as the Goddess of the Harvest, because this is based on percentile. It's the fourth or fifth best Pantheon. Like, it's a really good Pantheon choice. It just doesn't have that wow factor that something like God of the Forge, Earth Goddess, or Goddess of the Harvest have. So personally, I really like this Pantheon, so I gave it a few extra points in my own sort of personal bias, mainly because it kicks in really early. You get access to pastures very early in the game. Culture is very strong, and it can help you snowball, which is really good, because the more culture you get, the more cards you get access to, and the more cards you get access to, the more you can generate of all the other resources. So cards are really, really strong, and therefore culture is really, really strong. The only major downsides of the God of the Open Sky is that you're reliant on pastures, which require builder charges, so it's limited by infrastructure, and it's also limited by map generation, so it can be a bit situational and unreliable. You know, you might get one game where you get 8 pastures and you get 8 culture per turn, you know, by the classical era. And then you might get another game where you get, you know, 2 pastures and you get 2 culture per turn in the ancient era. I mean, that's still good. Like, that's still really, really good. It's just a little bit, it's not very, very consistent. It's just decently consistent. Like, you can almost always get some value out of it because pastures are so common. And then we have God of the Sea, which is sort of in the same boat, pun intended, as God of the Open Sky. It gives you a really strong early game yield on tiles that are already very strong. Well, I wouldn't say, maybe fishing boats are only like decently strong. It kicks in quite early. And it improves, in particular, it improves coastal cities, which can always have a bit of a, like, I don't want to say always, but I often have a struggle getting production in my coastal cities, and picking up that extra little bit early game can really help get those cities kickstarted. And it kind of helps you throughout the whole game too. It has a little bit of a snowball potential. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I do think, though, the things that are kind of working against it are that it requires infrastructure, and it again is limited by map generation. So my personal bias is I actually kind of like God of the Sea more than the God of the Open Sky. I have more fun when I play with God of the Sea because it's less limited by map generation. There tends to be a lot more fishing boat tiles than there are pasture tiles. And, you know, I'm a bit of a production hoarder. I love tiles that give me production. Then we have religious settlements. Now, this is another decently strong Pantheon. It's very, very consistent. In fact, it's probably one of the most consistent Pantheons other than the City Growth Rate 10% higher from fertility rights. It's a very, very consistent because it's always helping you. It's always giving you value. It kicks in extremely early into the game, and it can save you many different yields and get you extra yields and all that sort of stuff. If you pick up important tiles earlier, you can improve them. There are sort of some downsides to it. It can be a little bit inconsistent to use religious settlements. Like, you might not always get good tiles out of it, but it's always useful. It's a little bit inconsistent, and to get the full benefit from it, you often need to spend a builder charge. So that's kind of like a little bit of a con to it as well. But overall, I would rate it as like, this is a good Pantheon if you just don't know what to take. Just take religious settlements and you'll be fine. Or if a particular Pantheon that you wanted is gone, religious settlements, it's a decent one to take. It's going to just help you that little bit throughout the game. Then we have Desert Folklore, which is holy sites get +1 faith from adjacent desert tiles. Now, faith is really, really strong, but this doesn't give you a huge amount of faith. It gives you a decent amount of faith, so that's why I gave it a strength rating of 3. And it's a little bit situational because it relies on desert. It relies on desert adjacency, which can be a little bit limited by map generation. Desert is very common, so that's kind of working in its favor. So I would say it's pretty well rated. It's an okay Pantheon. It's not like the best Pantheon. It's not like the worst Pantheon. Like, it's okay. If you're in a situation to get value from it, it's good. It's a good Pantheon. It's okay. It gives you a decent amount of faith. Again, faith is very flexible. Faith is hard to get. And importantly, it also improves bad land. And desert is fairly common, like I talked about earlier. So improving common and bad land, that's that's kind of a couple of pluses in my book. So that's why I can sometimes consider taking Desert Folklore. Of course, again, it's limited by your map generation and it requires infrastructure. You have to build holy sites to take advantage of it. So there's kind of, there are downsides, but, there's a decent amount of upsides. Now we have stone circles. This I would rate as a 3 in strength and a 3 in situationalness, sort of from an objective standpoint, which gives it a score of 9. But from my experience of playing, I think it definitely deserves like a score of 4 or possibly even lower. The +2 faith from quarries is nice. The problem is I pretty much only ever build one quarry in my entire game, and that's just to get the boost towards the tech that gives you ancient walls, whose name I forget. It does give you faith. Faith is flexible. Faith is hard to get. Stone is very common, so it's good. The problem is it's limited by map generation. Chopping stone is way better than improving stone, and it doesn't really give you that much faith. I think, in fact, if you do a Goddess of the Harvest with Magnus on a stone tile, you'll pretty much, if you're like, say, in the medieval era, you'll pretty much get as much faith in one chop as you would likely get out of stone circles over most of the game. And then you can just put a mine on that tile usually, because quarries, the stone tends to spawn on hills and you can just drop a mine, which is better. I mean, if you have a lot of flat land stone and you don't have a whole lot of production tiles like mines and stuff, I think stone circles can be good. It gives you extra value out of those stone. But I think it feels a little bit anemic and low impact to me to really give it a good high rating. So I even though it's rated as a 9 objectively, I'm going to knock its score down to like a 4, possibly even a 1. Then we've got the God of Healing. This increases your healing by 30 in your Holy Site district or any adjacent tiles. I would say this is a pretty good Pantheon. It's not amazing. It's a bit situational, but it's reasonably strong. It's an okay Pantheon. It's another one of these okay Pantheons. Once we're into the yellows, yellow is like, it's okay. Green is really good. Yellow is like, it's okay. So I give it a few extra points because I enjoy healing, and when I do go to war, I really enjoy going for a religion/war combo where I use Crusade, and God of Healing synergizes with that very nicely. Of course, there are other Pantheons you can take that synergize even better with a religious war. But God of Healing can be nice if you're going for a domination game against a lot of religious civilizations, because you can just heal from their holy sites after you conquer their city. So that's really, really nice. It helps you sustain your momentum, and war is already pretty strong, and I think it's a lot of fun to use. So that's why I give it that little boost, because it's a fun Pantheon. It's not amazing. It's a nice Pantheon. Of course, the downside is that it can be inconsistent because there is it's kind of reliant on your enemies having holy sites if you're using it offensively, and if you're using it defensively, it requires you to build some infrastructure. You need holy sites. So then we've got Sacred Path. This is probably, it's kind of like on the same level as like Desert Folklore or the Tundra Pantheon. It gives you faith from adjacent rainforest tiles in your holy sites. I would say, yeah, it's about a 9. Like, it's about a 9. But in experience, my way of playing and the way that I have gotten to understand the deity level gameplay, I'm going to have to bring it down to like a 2, possibly even a 1. And there's several reasons for that. It requires infrastructure. You have to build holy sites to get this benefit. You have to keep rainforest around, and rainforest are really, really bad tiles. I think you're way better off chopping rainforests with the Goddess of the Harvest than you are taking Sacred Path, in my opinion. However, it does provide you with faith, and again, faith is flexible, faith is hard to get, and it gives you an okay amount of faith. And rainforest is very common, so like if you want to play a game maybe as Brazil or something and you want to have a little bit of faith coming from your rainforests, this isn't a terrible Pantheon to go for. Now we've got River Goddess. This gives you +1 amenity to cities if they have a holy site district adjacent to a river. I give this, it's sort of a similar power level to all of these guys. It's like, it's decently strong, it's decently consistent. I give it a little bit of a bump just because I enjoy using the Pantheon, and it has some really great combos with the Khmer, for example, with their aqueducts and holy sites on rivers thing that they can do with the extra food and faith and amenities they can generate. It's a lot of fun with the Khmer, but generally it's, it requires infrastructure. It's fairly low impact. It is limited by map generation. It conflicts with your normal district placement because you might want to put a commercial hub on your river, and you might want to put your holy site next to a mountain, but there's no river beside that mountain, so maybe you put it on the river to get the amenities. So now you're kind of changing how you play. There's trade-offs and push-pull relationships between these things, you know? So it's kind of it's good, but it's a little bit situational. Of course, amenities are very limited in the game. It can be hard to get amenities if you don't invest a lot into getting amenities. So this is a really flexible benefit, in my opinion. So it's a good one. It's kind of fun to play around with. Then we've got City Patron Goddess. I think this is a decently strong bonus. It's very consistent. So I did bump up its score a little bit. I don't think this properly reflects its score. I gave it that little bit of a bump up to 12. Its main advantage is that it gives you some production. It helps your cities kickstart, which is really, really good. And districts are already really strong, so applying your production bonus to districts is really nice. Of course, applying a general production bonus would be better. If you could just get 25% production, like that would be amazing. But 25% production towards a good thing, that's pretty good. It also applies really early into the game, and it can help you snowball. Again, snowballing is a thing in Civ 6, and there are a few Pantheons that can specifically really help you snowball. The major downside is that it has a limited useful window. It has a limited window where it's actually doing anything for you. You know, you build your first district and then that's it. I don't know. There's probably some like things you can abuse with it, like almost building districts to completion and then finishing them all in the same turn. But that's kind of like, that's a lot of micromanagement and a lot of sacrificed and tied up production to get a 25% bonus. I don't know if that would be worth it. Now, the God of Craftsmen gives you +1 production from mines over strategic resources. This is actually a really strong bonus in my opinion. The problem is that it's a little bit inconsistent, so I knocked it down a little bit. You can see here, this is its strength, inconsistency, and then total score is 8, and I knocked it down a little bit, but just because in my experience, you know, getting production is really good. And it reinforces tiles that are already really strong. The problem is that almost always whenever I get my Pantheon, I'm picking this kind of blindly. I don't know if I'm going to get much use out of it, and it can be a bit inconsistent in that way. It's also very limited by map generation, and it can be potentially totally useless if you get no iron or no niter, or if you accidentally, you know, without knowing and blindly put a district on a piece of iron or niter, you know, then boom, that's just gone. You're not going to get the benefit. But I mean, when it is working for you, it's pretty good. Then we've got fertility rights. The city growth rate is 10% higher. This is a very consistent bonus that has sort of a fairly low power level, I would say. It's another one of those it's okay kind of Pantheons. It's good. It's very, very consistent. Again, it's another one of these Pantheons that has the potential to snowball you because growth is very, very strong. For example, if you grow, you know, 3 turns sooner than someone, you can work another tile 3 turns sooner. So that's not like, oh, I grew 10% faster. That's like, oh, I got 3 more turns of working a mine than him. So maybe I get my first night out 3 turns sooner or something. You get what I'm saying? You know, it can be this sort of thing that snowballs your advantage. And so that's why it's pretty good. The only problem is that growth is extremely limited by your infrastructure, particularly housing and amenities. It can be limiting to try to grow cities, particularly once you hit, say, around late classical, early medieval, if you don't go for monarchy for the housing from walls, which can be, I think this could be quite good in that situation where you are going for like a monarchy build, but it feels an awful lot like it's a lot of work to get a fairly mediocre snowball bonus. It's good. It's another one of these it's another one of these Pantheons you can take if you're like, oh, I don't know what Pantheon I should take. I'm just going to take something that's really consistent. I'm taking fertility rights. Then we've got the Lady of the Reeds and Marshes. This gives you +1 production from marsh, oasis, and floodplains. Again, it's another one of these Pantheons that gives you production, which is really, really nice. Production is very strong, and it reinforces weak tiles, and it doesn't require any infrastructure. So those are all really nice things in its favor. That's why it's like a 4 in power, but a 2 in situationalness, because for, you know, it's limited by map generation. There are times when you'll get a lot of it, and there's times when you'll get none of it. You know, it's that sort of a thing. It's a little bit too inconsistent to be rated any higher. So I think it's kind of sits around at that, like, it's an okay Pantheon level. I also think some of the things that go against it are that it's limited by map generation, which is one I've already mentioned. But also, I think chopping marshes is a very strong thing to do, particularly if you can replace it with a farm triangle, because they can become very powerful in the mid and late game. God of War. This is what I would describe as basically a trash tier Pantheon. You should almost never pick it. On paper, it seems like it has a decent amount of strength, and it's pretty consistent. Like, you know, you're going to be killing, if you build holy sites, you're going to probably be killing things near your holy site. The problem is that it requires infrastructure. It's really inconsistent. It has a really low impact, and it has a really low faith generation. You know, the AI does tend to build a lot of units, but if you kill, for example, a swordsman, you're getting 18 faith. Okay, that's cool. But it has to be within range of your holy site. It has to be, you know, there's all these kind of conditions and stuff, and you have to kill a unit within 8 tiles of your holy site, and it just feels a little bit anemic and low impact. So I can't really justify it being a useful Pantheon. Now, Monument to the Gods is another one of these situational with a decent power level Pantheons. There are some problems with it though, and that's why I gave it a much lower score in my biased sample. It gives you production, which is really, really good, and it applies to some of the strongest wonders in the game. Stuff like the pyramids, Petra. I can't remember if Petra is medieval or not. It's probably classical. My brain is faulty. But like Petra, Colosseum, pyramids, and stuff like that. I think Mausoleum is in there, and that sort of ancient era, classical era thing. You know, it applies to really, really strong wonders, but again, it has this sort of, you know, limited window of availability, and chopping is already so strong that you can almost always secure early game wonders, so it's like not really necessary to take this. It'll help, but it just feels like it has a really low impact, because on deity in particular, I really don't think you should go for wonders unless you can do chops, in particular overflow chops. For example, where you build a galley and then you put in the 100% naval production card, and then on the final turn of the galley, you chop a forest with Magnus in the city, so you can overflow that into the wonder, and you can build the wonder really quickly. So I really don't think a 15, when you're getting like 150, when you're getting like 100% multiplied by 50%, when you're getting all these like other big modifiers, a 15% production boost on deity just doesn't really cut the mustard. It just feels really, really anemic. Oral tradition is another one of these pantheons that should be strong on paper because it gives you culture. It's a little bit inconsistent though, because it is limited by map generation. So it kind of sits around this sort of, this is what I would call like anything with a score of 6 or lower. These are what I would call the bad pantheons. These are the ones that you should really not pick. You should really not pick anything with like a score of 7, of 7 or lower. Maybe we'll call it 6 or lower. 6 or lower, these are like the bad pantheons now that we're getting to. God of War is a bad pantheon. Monument to the Gods is a bad pantheon. Oral tradition is a bad pantheon. It does give you culture, which is really strong, and it does reinforce tiles that can be kind of weak or decent. But the problem is that it requires infrastructure, and that infrastructure comes fairly late into the game relative to a lot of these bonuses. You might think, you get your plantations unlocked fairly early, and that's fairly true, but something like, typically in my games, like half of a game's turns happen in the ancient era, and it might be halfway through the ancient era that I actually pick up pantheons or plantations, and it might be like a quarter of the way through the ancient era that I pick up my pantheon. Like say turn 25ish, I pick up my pantheon, and then turn 50, I pick up plantations. So there's like a 25 turn window here potentially with oral tradition if I don't rush it, which causes me to lose out on some of my other things that I'm going to be trying to do. So I feel like there's this big window where I'm not getting any benefit from oral tradition. And it's also limited by map generation. It has a low impact, generally speaking. A lot of these tiles I like to harvest, for example, bananas. Especially if bananas are on a hill, I like to chop the jungle and harvest the banana and then stick a mine on the hill. It just doesn't feel good to use, and it doesn't feel strong to me. Now, religious idols is actually a pantheon that's quite good. Even though it is sort of rated on that 6, I gave it that extra couple of points, right? It's good, but it's reasonably strong. It gives you a little bit of faith. It's a little bit inconsistent, though. That's its problem. Its main problem is that it's inconsistent, but it is a little bit better than some of these other ones, and I just felt like it didn't belong here. It gives you faith, and again, faith is strong, faith is hard to get, faith is flexible, all these other great things. Faith is a really, really good thing. It also reinforces tiles that you're already likely to work. Typically, mines are some of my highest priority tiles, so anything that buffs mines is really, really nice. So this is why I kind of bumped it up a little bit, just to take it out of the sort of the bad Pantheon zone. It is, of course, limited by your map generation. It doesn't give you a lot of faith. And, you know, it just doesn't feel like there are enough luxury and bonus mine resources to justify it. You know what I mean? Then we have Dance of the Aurora, which is holy sites get +1 faith from adjacent tundra tiles. This is similar to the rainforest and desert Pantheon. However, tundra, I feel, is almost even weaker than desert, because desert tends to come in little clumps that you can kind of like settle around and you can just kind of like slap a holy site in it and get the benefit of it. But tundra tends to come in these big, huge chunks with mountains in them. So it's like you kind of have to settle tundra, whereas you can, to get the benefit of this, which tundra is really weak, whereas with the desert Pantheon, you can typically settle on the edge of the desert in some nice territory and then just stick a holy site in the desert, you know what I mean? And you can just use the desert tiles for districts, which is really cool. But for the tundra, it just feels a lot worse than the other ones in practice, even though on paper it's potentially better because it actually has better faith generation, because there tends to be a lot more tundra and you can get the benefit from it a lot easier. And faith is so strong, and it improves, sort of quote unquote, improves your bad land. It makes bad lands less terrible because you're getting a bunch of faith. But in practice, I just don't really like this one. I would maybe say that it is better than Sacred Path. And you can see here, I did give Sacred Path a score of 2 in my own personal rating system. So I definitely think this one is still usable. It's like on the edge of being bad, situationally quite good, but it's kind of like, it's a little weak. It's not weak due to any reason of its own. It's mainly just, you know, situational stuff like tundra being weak. The Goddess of Festivals is another Pantheon that I really think is super, super terrible. +1 food from wine, incense, cocoa, tobacco, and olives, coffee, and tea plantations. Ugh. Okay, first of all, where do I even begin? It's sort of a similar thing to the oral tradition. Everything that's wrong with the oral tradition things is wrong with this, but worse. So, like, it is limited by your map generation. It has a low impact. Plantations come late into the game relative to the other Pantheons that buff other things like pastures. And then it has the added effect of not generating culture, but generating food. Food is really nice and food is decently strong. And they do reinforce tiles that I would consider fairly weak and makes them, you know, quite good. But growth is often limited by infrastructure, housing, and amenities. Again, it's one of these things where it's quite good, and this could help you snowball a little bit. But I think you would almost always, like, if you went for this, why not just go for the one that gives you plus 10% growth rate? Like, this, it's very unlikely that you're going to get more than 10% growth rate on average across your empire from this Pantheon. So why wouldn't you just take fertility rights? This feels really, really weak. Then we've got Goddess of the Hunt, and this is sort of all of the similar problems to the oral tradition and Goddess of Festivals. +1 food is great, but it applies to a very limited scope of tiles. It applies to like truffles, elephants, and deer, and furs, and like that's it. That's all of them. I can't remember if truffles use a camp or a plantation. I think truffles are a camp as well. So it applies to like 5-ish tiles, and most of those tiles are luxury tiles, which tend to be a little bit less common than, say, bonus resources. You know, it does give you growth. Growth is strong, and it reinforces tiles that are already quite good. But, you know, I just feel like most of the time, the benefit you're going to be getting this from is going to be on your deer tiles. And I just feel like chopping deer is better than working deer in most situations. Deer chop for about the same amount of production as a stone chop, and they often have a forest on top of them. So whatever you're going for, you can just chop the deer in the forest and instantly pump out like a tank, or pump out like a knight, or a couple of knights, or maybe a few swordsmen. Whereas, you know, if you're working that for that little bit of food, you know, you're often limited by your amenities, your housing, and your infrastructure anyway. So the food ends up being pretty low impact. And then there's initiation rites, which I would kind of consider a bit of a joke pantheon. There are situations in which on paper, this pantheon could actually be quite good. However, in practice, there's a lot of really big downsides. So if you were to take this pantheon, I would have to assume that you already have a way of generating faith, right? So it could be a way to get a great profit without having to build a holy site and then build a great profit and then build a holy site later. The problem is that, you know, it's extremely inconsistent, has extremely limited opportunities. You know, I might run into, you know, I could have a game where I run into 0 barbarian camps, and I could have another game where I maybe run into like 8. It's just a little bit, the variance there is too high. I would say on average, I run into like 2 to 3, and then, you know, pretty occasionally 4 barbarian camps in the early game. But yeah, it just feels so anemic and weak. And yeah, that's it. That's the whole Pantheon list. This file, again, is available for public viewing and commentary and feedback and all that stuff on the... should be in the... I'll put it in the description and the comment section of the video. I do have a couple of notes here, and I will be expanding this. This will be something I continuously develop and work on as new expansions come out. As I continue to play the game, I'll revisit this every time they make changes. There's also some notes on my biases, for example. The bias is a representation of my bias from experience or playstyle. I tend to chop a lot. I tend to play deity versus the AI, and I am biased in favor of culture victories. Culture victories are kind of my favorite way to win. And I also typically play pacifist versus deity. So there might be some things in here, if you play a little bit differently, you might feel differently about other pantheons. Like if you don't like chopping, you might actually, like, Goddess of the Harvest might be one of the worst pantheons for you. I still think it's really, really good, and I think it's pretty hard to contest that it's good. But, you know, I think there is something to be said of how playstyle and how we feel about the game affects how we play, because I think that's important. I think often when we're doing tier lists, we sort of get into this mindset where it's about being the best and being competitive, when sometimes when I'm playing, even I'll just pick, for example, God of the Healing, which really isn't a very good pantheon on paper, but I just pick it because I have a lot of fun and it's enjoyable to use, and I'm not playing against other people. When I'm having a competitive game, of course, I'll, like 99% of the time, I'm going to pick Goddess of the Harvest. But sometimes I just want to play around with these other ones, and you know, you don't have to play the exact way I say you do. Like, if you don't want to use Goddess of the Harvest, don't worry about it. But if you want sort of the feedback of somebody who's relatively experienced with the game, I could check how many hours I have now. I have a decent number of hours in the game. Probably upwards of 1,000 by now, I'd say. You know, if you want to take my feedback and I play a lot of deity, you know, this would be what I feel. But if you're not playing deity, if you don't care about, you know, playing the most effective way that you can, don't worry about this. But if you are somebody who wants to improve and develop as a player while playing Civilization 6, I think this could be a useful thing. And don't be afraid to give me feedback. Don't be afraid to disagree with me. I'm really looking forward to seeing where people disagree with me on this tier list, because I think that's going to help me develop it and improve it over time. So you can actually, if you right click, I believe you can leave comments on particular numbers. So if you disagree with my strength rating of Goddess of the Harvest, go ahead and leave me a comment over here, although there just revealed my name. Nice. If you feel like I left something out, right click, comment, suggest edits, do all that stuff. I'll be keeping an eye on this. I'll probably check it like once every couple of weeks and make sure that I'm keeping it up to date. But yeah, that's the whole tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you find it useful. If you have other things you'd like me to do analysis on, go ahead and let me know. I'd really appreciate that. And I hope you guys are having a swell weekend. I love you all very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. I also hope you're having a swell week, in case it's the week when you watch this and not the weekend. But it's the weekend when I'm recording this and when I'm uploading it. So just, you know, okay, bye-bye.